Good afternoon. I think this is an unchaired session, so I introduce myself. My name is Alfonso Cruz. I work in Madrid, and I've been asked to discuss in the next half an hour physical aspects of frailty. And as you may have noticed, I've changed slightly the title that's shown there and added some epidemiology, because as I will show in the last part of the presentation, epidemiology of physical frailty and sarcopenia, which are common concepts, are very tricky aspects to explore. So I'll devote only a part of the presentation. But the first thing we should look at is at the concept of frailty. There's still no agreement, even if there are many consensus conferences on what's frailty. But so we can start looking at clever people. This is the Pope Benedict. When he resigned, he let us a very nice introduction of what's frailty. He said that his strengths were no longer suited to the exercise of the profession he should lead. And as you see, in at least 3 or 4 times he mentions strengths, which is a physical concept. So he did not have physical and mental strength to continue doing what he had been doing before. After looking at people, we can look at books. And this is my favorite definition of frailty. I know it's not scientific, it's Paul Auster, an American writer, but he describes very nicely how, as we grow old, we start suffering minor drawbacks in several aspects of our lives. And they reduce our ability to cope. That means they make us vulnerable. And this vulnerability makes that very small drawbacks in old age can resound as major conflicts or major tragedies. So this is a very nice description of physical frailty. In fact, if you look at the definition proposed by Linda Fried when she started all the developments of physical frailty, you can find that's quite similar to the one described in the book. It says that this is a syndrome where you have decreased reserve and resistance to stressors, and that this results from cumulative declines across multiple systems, not from a single decline in a single organ. This definition has a very important condition in it, and that was mentioned by Bruno Velas and John Morley this morning. We're looking at physical frailty and frailty as a vulnerable state that comes before disability or only with minor disability. Of course, if you're severely disabled, and that's a very common way to explain, I have a very frail, disabled person who comes from a nursing home. That's usual medical language. We're talking there, it's not exactly this concept of frailty. Of course, they are also frail because they are already disabled, but it's not exactly the same thing. The problem in understanding and defining frailty is that this is a very complex task to do. When you look at frailty, you say it's multidimensional. And at least you can accept that there's a physical frailty, that there's a cognitive frailty, and that's a big problem, for instance, for designing clinical trials. There's a lot of discussion if cognitive impaired people have to be included in physical frailty trials, and there's also some social frailty. As this is difficult, if you start adding some elements of frailty, and you will accept that a person with a high level of multimorbidity is frail, that who has low physical activity or low energy or low mobility may be frail, those who have emotional problems or cognitive problems are frail, those who have spiritual or financial problems are frail. So frailty is very complex to understand. That's the reason why this talk is mostly on that part. That's the physical aspects of frailty. Why? Because this is the only area where we have some research to make operational decisions on frailty, and where we can start doing some preventive trials and treatment therapeutic trials. Of the part on the right hand of the line, we're still trying to define what's the population at risk and what's vulnerability and what's real disease in these cases. If you have a look at screening tools and you have a look at diagnostic definitions of frailty. In fact, there are very many domains included, but the domain that's mostly included is physical function and gait, speed, or mobility. The third one is cognition. And then many others here, physical activity and weight, are in fact physical aspects. But again, as this is a big blend of things, you find that in many definitions you still are looking for basic activities of daily living, and one could argue that this is already disability, or instrumental activities of daily living. There is a problem in the definitions, and there is a problem in the definition of physical frailty that is related to the degree of disability that's acceptable into frailty as vulnerability, as opposed to frailty as a big share of problems, including disability. There are some studies now on clustering of these symptoms and these dimensions. And it's interesting that they cluster different with different instruments, but mostly cognition is a part, and all the rest of the aspects of physical frailty seem to cluster together in some degree, except for physical activity. That's usually something a bit different, but it's defined different by different instruments. It's then not surprising that when Linda Fried tried to identify a phenotype of what can be called frail, pre-fail, or robust, the 5 dimensions that were chosen by this group based on epidemiological data were 5 physical dimensions. There's no social or cognitive dimensions. Of course, social and cognitive dimensions may damage those, but the 5 of them, weight loss, exhaustion, weakness, slow walking speed, and physical activity, are in fact physical frailty. That's why I added to the slide that the phenotype of frailty that we're using for most trials should be called phenotype of physical frailty, because this is really physical frailty. This is a slide taken from Jean-Pierre Michel, who's sitting in the front, and I think this is good to understand the relation between physical frailty, robustness, and dependency. When you're robust, you have a very high physiological reserve. You've used very little, so you can stand drawbacks and diseases and problems in your life quite decently. But when you're frail, you have exhausted most of your reserve. So at this time, minor problems will lead you into disability. Of course, if you go down, you lose all your reserve and you start having dependency in different dimensions of physical activity. That's usually basic and instrumental ADLs and mobility, the ability to walk. Of course, if you take both frailty and disability, you have very good prognosis indications. This is a study with MPI and with the index of frailty proposed by Rockwood. As you may know, Rockwood shows a different approach to frailty, and he says that if you include 30 dimensions with yes or no, whatever dimensions, if you're able to see, if you're able to walk, if you have certain diseases, and you add them into an index of frailty, that also measures your reserve. But the problem with these indexes, which, as I say, are very good in predicting what's happening, it's that they have a blend of people who are vulnerable but not yet disabled, and also disabled. When you do research in physical frailty, you have to choose what's your approach. And it seems sensible, if you go back to the previous slide, to go to frailty before disability, instead of going to frailty together with high levels of disability, because populations are different. And as Bruno Vella said this morning, we've been working with the latest for long as geriatricians, those who are already disabled. So it's time to move forward and start looking at those who are yet vulnerable or starting in the downside. I said that sarcopenia is probably a good concept to understand physical frailty, and I'll try to show that now. This is the definition that was also shown this morning from the first time sarcopenia was proposed as a word. And if you look carefully, it says that there's a decline in body mass, and this decline affects ambulation, mobility, energy intake, independence, and breathing. If you read that, you could think, okay, this is what's called sarcopenia, but isn't it very close to what we're calling now physical frailty? Isn't that very close to the phenotype of physical frailty? I think it is. You're all aware that there are very many definitions of sarcopenia. The oldest one, called only sarcopenia as low muscle mass. All modern definitions have muscle mass plus muscle function, including strength and physical performance, or at least physical performance defined by gait speed or by 400-meter walking or for 6-minute walking, whatever. Physical performance, muscle strength. This is a European definition, but most experts agree that now sarcopenia is not only low muscle mass, which is a concept of morphology, but also muscle mass plus function, which is a functional condition, which is again close to frailty. And if you look carefully at the phenotype of frailty, of the 5 dimensions proposed by Linda Free, 3 of them are the core of the European definition of sarcopenia. And the other 2, endurance and low activity, are the ones that are more difficult to measure. So in the core of physical frailty, you can find modern definitions of sarcopenia. Why is this, and why is this important? When we look into physical frailty, what we are looking for is to prevent disability. And to prevent, you have to be able to prognose who will have disability. And we know muscle mass, muscle mass does not define mobility problems or disability in the future, but muscle strength and muscle function do define subjects who are prone to have physical disability in the near future. So it seems to be logical to look to muscle function as a marker of decline if we want to prevent that decline. Another important element in understanding physical frailty, in fact, is rooted in nosology. Nosology is the systematic classification of diseases. And if you notice, we're here and there's a big research congress on sarcopenia and frailty, because these are not diseases coded in ICD-10. We are trying to do something that was done in the 19th century for most diseases, in the 21st century, to redefine or to define a new disease. And we don't have the tools, it's not the same as in the 19th century. We're trying to define, the first question is frailty or sarcopenia. Are they normal aging? Are they a disease that can be defined as a single disease, as happens in other organs? Are just the consequences of disease? Or are they geriatric syndromes? Most experts argue now that they are geriatric syndromes. This is 2 papers, Frailty and Emerging Geriatric Syndrome, Understanding Sarcopenia as a Geriatric Syndrome. There seems to be agreement in modern definitions that this is a syndrome, both frailty and sarcopenia, and it's easier to understand them if we look at them as a syndrome than as a condition or a consequence of conditions. And let me explain what does this mean as a geriatric syndrome. This is a usual medical disease. In a disease, we know the etiology, pathophysiology, and the presenting symptoms. So with that, we define diseases. But we still have some syndromes in medicine. In syndromes, usually we don't know one of these 3 elements. And you can agree, in chronic fatigue, we only know the symptoms, the presenting symptoms, nothing below. This is Cushing syndrome, Marfan syndrome. When we don't know some part of it, we call that a medical syndrome. These are not geriatric syndromes, and neither of these models fit into physical frailty or sarcopenia. The model that fits better is multiple etiologies, multiple interacting pathways to a unified manifestation. This is, for instance, delirium, which is a very classic and well-known geriatric syndrome, but you would agree that sarcopenia and frailty best fit there. To understand in clinical practice and to know why we're having so big problems in defining sarcopenia and frailty, the problem is that we are finding now there's a unified manifestation showed by a phenotype or by a frailty index or by some diagnostic instruments, but now we're trying to explore back into etiology, which is a major discussion and a major question for research that most of you are now trying to explore. In many presentations in this Congress, we have answers to some parts of that. This is also true for cycles. We try to understand that complexity using cycles, and I have slides of at least 10 different frailty cycles published in the literature. All of them are quite complex. They include here sarcopenia is low muscle mass, muscle wasting, but they include all the things that you usually find in other geriatric syndromes. In any geriatric syndromes, being delirium or falls or dementia, you usually find some problems in your physical activity, you find some problems on nutrition, you find some problems on comorbidity, you find some problems on things that have happened to you along your life, even before you were born. But if you again look at some of these frailty cycles, you again, in physical frailty, you find that sarcopenia is in the middle. This is physical frailty, the 5 elements of Linda Fritz phenotype, and again, the 3 in the center of the cycle is sarcopenia. That's why I again argue that sarcopenia helps to understand physical frailty, because it's in the core of it. And this is a general framework that tries to explain what I've shown before. This was published by Professor Michel and myself. If we see frailty as a geriatric syndrome, we cannot forget all the other parts of frailty that are not physical. But it's important to define physical frailty, which is very close to sarcopenia. And it's important because then we can go back. As I said, we're going into risk factors and chronic diseases, multimorbidity, living conditions, and we're trying to avoid that part, adverse outcomes. The definition of sarcopenia, the European definition, said that this is a problem, loss of muscle mass and function is a problem because it leads you into adverse outcomes. The definitions of physical frailty and of general frailty say that the problem is that it leads or predicts adverse outcomes. So it's important that at the end we have these adverse outcomes. That's what we're trying to avoid, to prevent, to revert. The good news is that this is revertible. We can potentially revert sarcopenia and frailty and prevent or revert some of the outcomes. Some of the outcomes are not reversible, for instance, mortality, but some others may be, at least if you get them at the very, very beginning. This is the slide that John Morley stole from me this morning. This is a picture by Lucas Cranach the Elder. As you see, people come not frail, but very disabled into this swimming pool. Apart from exercise, they seem to be getting some specific ingredient there. And then they are not frail, robust, which means they are eating and dancing and doing whatever they do in this tent here. So the good news is that sarcopenia and physical frailty may be reversible. And there are now some experimental data, some epidemiologic data that show that this is true. This is the model. The model is you go from non-frail, pre-frail, frail to death, and there are some longitudinal studies that show that there are transitions, even unforced transitions. I mean, these are not forced by intervention. It's happening in real life. Some people go from frail to pre-frail, and some people go back spontaneously or with the help or the treatment of single diseases that are treated by usual medical care. The important message of such studies is that it's more important to define pre-frail, I mean those who are starting frailty, better than those that are in late frailty. Because those who are starting frailty have a higher risk of mortality and other adverse outcomes, but are more prone to reversion than those who are already in the late stages of frailty. So if we look to physical frailty, it's very important, it's key to define it early. And then we look at what are our diagnostic tools, and the problem is they are very bad. They're not easy to understand. We had a talk this morning by John Morley explaining the Frail instrument, which is very simple and can be done in minutes. This is good for screening, but when you try to go from screening to real assessment, you need all the 7 hours done in the Geronto Paul Frailty Clinic to do the full assessment of frailty. It's not easy. And if you look at the instruments to measure each dimension, this is a systematic review of measures of muscle mass, strength, and physical performance. And if you see, the evidence is not as good for any as you see. If you see G, which is good, solid evidence, in most cases, the G is void. We don't have very good instruments to measure physical performance or muscle strength, even if we think they are good. If you look at the measure abilities, they're not as good as we think. So now I come to the final part of my talk on epidemiology, and you will understand why I say only some epidemiology. If you look at reported prevalence of frailty in the community, which is an homogeneous population, or at least should be, it's not nursing homes or hospitals, prevalence goes from 4% to 60%. If in community dwelling people we find such huge differences from 4 to 60, there seems something wrong in the way we're measuring frailty. Don't you think so? There are some logical things. This study shows by age, and it shows that the higher the age, the higher the rate of frailty, which is logical. It shows that women are more frail than men. But the problem, being a systematic review, is again the wideness of the range of prevalence found. Look at this. This is one of the first. It was done by the SHARE study, which is a big European longitudinal study that's ongoing. And this is the prevalence of pre-frailty and frailty in different European countries. It's surprising, again. In Spain, we have double or three times as frailty as Switzerland. There's no simple explanation for that, for this huge variability. Here, they took the SHARE study and they tried to use the same variables that were defined by Linda Fried in the phenotype with measures that they already had in the SHARE questionnaire. So what I did is I went to a Spanish study. This is the SHARE, prevalence 7.5. In a similar study sample from Spain, the prevalence was significantly higher, 10%. But if you look at both, and they were both using apparently the same domains, the domains that were defining frailty were completely different, even double for exhaustion, and again double for weakness. So even if we think we're using the same questions, we're not. The only study that I know that's using the original Linda Fried's definition exactly as it was defined is the Inchianti study, but most of the other epidemiological studies are doing adaptations of the questions. And in some cases, some elements of Linda Fried's definition are not well validated in different languages. So we're using bad instruments again. That's how and why epidemiological studies on frailty and also on sarcopenia are not so easy to understand. On Friday morning at 8:30, Professor Cederholm will be showing a study by a group called EASY, International Sarcopenia Initiative. It's a blend between the European group and the International Sarcopenia Working Group, 19 experts from 4 continents. And this is a systematic review on the prevalence of sarcopenia using only modern definitions. Modern means those that use sarcopenia as muscle mass plus function, not only muscle mass as the previous ones. And as you see, in community individuals, again, the prevalence goes from 1 to 29%, which is, again, huge variability. In care homes, from 14 to 33%. And there's a single study in acute care, 10%. So, again, there seems to be a problem in the way epidemiological studies are being designed in sarcopenia. This document that will be presented on Friday has some recommendations for research. And without taking the full presentation from Tommy, what I'm showing here is 4 recommendations that apply for future research in epidemiological studies, both for physical frailty and sarcopenia. The first is we need well-powered studies, which we don't have, that also include not only prevalence but risk factors. If we look at risk factors, we can better understand what are the differences between populations and what are the predictors of disability, which is what we're really looking at. The predictors of adverse outcomes, not only the prevalence in general, if it's not linked with adverse outcomes. The second recommendation is that we need to better standardize the populations we're using. And we also need to explore baseline differences in different countries so we understand if the differences in prevalence are true differences in prevalence or just a technical difference based on the use of instruments. The third recommendation is that we need longitudinal studies, not only transversal studies, of course, to understand what's really happening and the link with outcomes. The fourth one is to look on reversibility, but you will have more of this on Friday morning. So what are my take-home messages of this talk on physical aspects of frailty? The first is that physical frailty is only an aspect of the big frailty phenomenon. And we have to be aware of that when we're reading a paper or designing a study. Physical frailty is not full frailty. And we should even state that in the title of papers, which is not done at this time. Say frailty in cancer, and it's only physical sometimes. The second is that the best way to understand physical frailty is as a geriatric syndrome using the complex concept I've shown before. The third message is that sarcopenia is a very good paradigm to understand physical frailty. In fact, there are some experts now that are talking about frailty-related sarcopenia, which is both concepts together, sarcopenic patients that include frailty measures as a very high-risk population to define for interventions. And the fourth is, as I've shown, that epidemiology has to be taken very carefully at this time if you want to understand what's happening in physical frailty. Thank you.